Good morning, Father Thomas.
Hi.
My name is Tom S., and I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. In keeping with the AA tradition of anonymity, I'll be off camera for this filming. We meet again at St. Benedict's Monastery in Snowmass, Colorado, and we must thank Abbot Joseph Boyle for permitting us to use these monastery grounds for today's interview. In my humble opinion, two of the greatest spiritual leaders of the 20th century were Bill Wilson, an alcoholic and co-founder of AA, and yourself, a Trappist priest, former abbot, and co-founder of Contemplative Outreach. You both have written books that enjoy immense popularity, in particular Alcoholics Anonymous by Bill Wilson, which was published in 1939, and your two books of recent vintage, An Invitation to Love and Open Mind, Open Heart. Also, you both have basically defined the spiritual journey for all of us as a movement from self-centeredness to God-centeredness. Bill Wilson even described the alcoholic as self-centered in the extreme. You seem to complement each other in the spiritual realm. One of Bill Wilson's key attitudes is in his journey is willingness, which seems to relate to the title of your book, Open Mind, Open Heart. Bill's main resource for the spiritual journey is the 12 steps. While yours is centering prayer, many of us in AA use centering prayer to accomplish the meditation requirement in AA's 11th step. We'll postpone a full discussion of centering prayer for now. But Father Thomas, would you agree with the short definition of centering prayer? That it is a disciplined meditation practice designed to reduce the obstacles to our spiritual awakening, using Bill Wilson's words.
I can accept that.
Good.
It covers many of the points that are involved in centering prayer method.
Good. I always like that term, spiritual awakening. I think it fits so well with your teachings.
Yes.
Father Thomas, how important is discipline in centering prayer or meditation?
Well, the main discipline is to sit down and shut up. And that's pretty difficult for most people. Because it doesn't just mean closing your mouth, but letting go of the usual stream of thoughts or the endless interior dialogue that goes on most of the day and night about what happens to us, or people entering and leaving our lives.
Yeah, I found for myself that regardless of whether I felt like it or not, I had to put aside that time every day, and it's that constant repetition on a daily basis that helped me most.
Well, we're dealing with a psyche, our ordinary psychological awareness, that is totally opposed to silence. And in many cases, nowadays, people have never heard silence. They've heard everything else. So it takes a practice, a discipline, a routine, a constant repetition, something like you have to impose on the body when you're trying to learn some physical skill. So this applies also to the mind, of course. It has to be trained and disciplined. And so it has to be, repetition is one of the chief tools of creating new habits, because the old habits we have come from doing something the same way over and over again, and some of them are very deeply rooted in us.
Thank you, Father. Chapter 5 of Alcoholics Anonymous which we fondly call the Big Book by AA members, contains a list of the 12 steps that Bill Wilson and early AA members took to achieve sobriety. Our main topic today will be step 1 of AA, which reads, "We admitted that we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable." Father Thomas, as we read this step, what thoughts or comments from your perspective rise to the surface?
Well, let's just say a very basic statement, and if it really represents an experience, it really is the basic psychological step that has to be taken in any spiritual progress. Now, in spiritual things, one is inspired by usually some religious figure or some belief in God or some aspect of religious practice. That isn't immediately present in the first step, at least I haven't heard it yet. It occurs further on in the steps. But it remains a very fundamental attitude if anybody who's trying to initiate a serious spiritual program, that is to say, a program of transformation of our debilitated consciousness and our experience of human weakness and our inability to overcome our habits or compulsions, no matter how much we want to. So what this first step highlights is this fact that all human beings are deeply wounded, and from earliest childhood and infancy, we start out the path to self-consciousness and to full human development without any idea of what happiness actually is as an experience, apart from the gratification of our instinctual needs for security, for affection, esteem, and approval, and for power and control. So these attitudes are essential to survive early childhood. Otherwise, the child would just roll over and die if it didn't have the motive for living that these instinctual needs provide. But human nature being what it is, and the world being a rather hazardous place, you can't always count on their fulfillment, and some children are terribly deprived in one or all of these three areas. But everyone is deprived in some degree because no parents are perfect. And even if they were, they can't control the environment and or teachers or important others that enter the child's life. So this poor little creature is pretty isolated in a very potentially hostile world. And it needs a lot of love, including concrete holding and touching and kissing and cooing and the rest of the parental arsenal of tools, that's in order to have a stable emotional life to deal with the ups and downs of everyday life and to establish meaningful relationships with God. This is an object of belief, with other people, with oneself, with the environment, the universe, all reality. So we approach this project then, coming from no self-consciousness to gradually increasing awareness of sense objects and then of other people and then of ourselves, our own body, of other people, and then the socialization period of early childhood from about 4 to 8 greatly complexifies our growing attachment to the fulfillment or gratification of those three energy centers, or at least emotional programs that have become energy centers around which our thoughts and feelings and desires circulate like planets around the sun, you might say. So the point I'm trying to make here is this consists of an addictive process. By that I mean that one is on a journey that can't possibly work, trying to find gratification without limit in those three emotional needs. And later on is added an over-identification with the group one comes from: family, ethnic group, community, village, tribe, country, or even religion. And now we're in a global village that's developing that was going to create a whole new set of relational problems if this world as a unity is going to survive. So in any case, the infant has identified happiness, for which it's innately programmed in virtue of being human and in virtue of having consciousness. It has to project that in a situation that is getting more and more unmanageable. It's learning that it can't control as much as it would like to, that it can't receive the approval that it would like to have, which is almost boundless, and that it can't count on survival and security because of the hazards of the human condition: disease, death, rejection, oppression, being part of a society that is exploited or downtrodden. All of these external hazards can greatly increase the sense of rejection or of human misery or of frustration of those programs with which the child has completely identified and possibly been inclined to through its temperament, genetic inheritance, its number on the Enneagram, and its parental situation, its social conditioning, its inheritance from its ancestors and the immediate family, and the attitudes of its companions when it learns how to talk. So what the alcoholic has experienced is the fossilization or the localization or the particularization of an attitude that is present in every human being, that has experienced, sometimes in some cases through genetic factors that make certain people more vulnerable to alcohol, but what it's experienced is a need to use alcohol in order to solve in the sense of anoint the pain that is increasingly great from the lack of fulfillment or of gratification of instinctual needs that have become literally fantastic, impossible to realize. The child doesn't have the use of reason in its first few years to moderate its desires. So it has no way to distinguish what is realistic in its desire for control or affection, esteem, and approval or security. So it wants a boundless amount of gratification in those areas. And when it experiences that gratification, then it experiences self-exaltation, pride, inflation. And if it experiences frustration, which is most of the time, then it experiences the automatic afflictive emotions that go off when a experience is perceived as unpleasant or not good for the organism at the level of sense or of reason or imagination or even spiritual goods if it has developed those. So it's confronted every day then with typical situations that frustrate its desires and with a kind of explosion, and perhaps 90% of its desires, maybe that's a little exaggerated, psychologists say, are unconscious. In other words, many of our deepest commitments to security or symbols of security or power or affection in the culture are rooted in such exaggerated desires that it would be absolutely impossible to achieve them, even if everybody supported us. But in actual fact, every other human being is trying to do the same stupid thing to try to find boundless happiness in a very limited good that you're in competition with 6.5 billion other people to attain. It just doesn't work. So the human condition is programmed of its very existence as we've known it since the beginning, its beginning 50,000 years ago or whenever it was. And it is been explained in certain religious areas as a fall from a higher state. And that's what the Bible suggests as an explanation for this situation. The Hindus have religions have a different explanation, call it Maya. Buddhists have a slightly different explanation. But all the world religions have perceived that this is the human condition as it actually is, and that it is virtually helpless to do much about this program for frequent, if not habitual, frustration. So as the pain of frustration increases, and grief or anger or discouragement or despair or shame or humiliation increases, it becomes necessary for the psyche to repress the events that are most painful into the unconscious, where their energy remains and is warehoused in the body and sometimes is accessed through deep massage. But it leaves everybody vulnerable to constant frustration. And this is why the religions of the world suggest disciplines or means to reduce the intensity or the amount of energy we put into one or all of these emotional programs, or an over-identification with our group that seeks their approval, even at the price of our own integrity or conscience, as the case may be. So in a sense then, everybody is in recovery or is on the way through the addictive process to developing an actual addiction. And this is why many folks in the 12 Steps program who have entered into recovery still have some serious problems and develop another addiction, possibly, or easily fall back into the one that they've struggled so hard to escape from. Unless they add to this the spiritual journey that is not only suggested, but outlined and in some sense transmitted through the faithful practice of the 12 Steps, which is a real path to freedom from the compulsions of the addictive process that eventually lead to the compulsion or the addiction of alcohol. But as we know, many people have found the steps also helpful for their other addictions. But what Alcohol Anonymous has contributed to society is a very clear set of principles that describes exactly what the problem is and a path out of it if people want to follow this path, which is not just a physiological discipline of refraining from alcohol, but is also addresses the deep emotional problems that was the source of the addiction in the first place. So emotional sobriety is the term that Bill W. uses for a mature 12-stepper who is beginning to translate the 12 steps into a spiritual experience of liberation, in which the emotional causes and attachments that set off the original addiction are now released or reduced so that there won't be another addiction to replace it or another fall from sobriety. And so those words are extremely powerful of the first step. Would you mind saying them again?
Sure. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol.
Stop there for a second.
Okay.
To be powerless means absolute helplessness. In other words, you can't do anything about it under your own steam or willpower or any amount of strategies. You're hooked, gone, sunk, overwhelmed, wiped out. And this, oddly enough, is the perfect disposition for the beginning of the spiritual journey. Why is that? Because the deeper one's awareness of this powerlessness, obviously, the more desperately you were willing to reach out for help. And as occurs in the next step or two, you turn yourself over to a higher power who is not powerless, who has the power to heal you or bring you out or to work with you in the long journey of dismantling the emotional programs for happiness, for security, power, control, affection, esteem, and approval that are the root cause in the first place of all the problems, and to replace a true idea of happiness and a practice to pursue it for the ersatz or the inadequate practices of trying to squeeze gratification or satisfaction, however momentary, out of the pleasures of life or out of the symbols of those three emotional programs that show up in the culture. And every culture has advertising, and notice every advertisement addresses one of those three programs, because that's what people are interested in and that's what they'll buy into. Once in a while you get a reference to the over-identification with the group, but these are the two pillars of what might be called the false self, the illusory self, the self that we think we are, that is going to find happiness in those emotional programs that can't possibly work in adolescent or adult life. They don't even work in infancy. So would you read the second half of that?
Yes.
Please.
That our lives had become unmanageable.
Okay. So this is the logical conclusion of being powerless over one kind of human activity into which we keep repeating and falling because we're powerless to resist. So the movement then of freedom is obviously to let go of not only the substance or the kind of activity or behavior that we realize we're powerless to control or to reduce or which may be damaging to other people or ourselves. We're not only aware of that, but we're aware that that weakness is spreading and is involving the whole of our life, our relationship with God, with other people, towards ourselves and towards the environment. Everything is subjected, all good is subjected to the desperate attempt to find a happiness that is impossible for these emotional programs to produce. And so the vicious circle or cycle then it begins, in which the energies that we've repressed of pain call for some kind of compensation or relief or reduction. and we return to that kind of contact that brought us temporary relief or soothing or forgetfulness or of the problem. And so again, then we go to find relief from the pain in our addiction. That then is frustrated. The unmanageable effects in every life begin to happen. We get more discouraged, more frustrated, and the cycle just reinforces our need to get away from the pain, because the pain keeps increasing as we recycle the pattern. Hence, it's obvious to see why in AA the community is so important, because we're powerless of ourselves. We don't have immediate awareness of the higher power and how it works. So we need to be constantly reminded, or in a sense, to propaganda ourselves over and over again as to what our commitment is to freedom and liberation, because the old patterns are so seductive that when they go off, they set off association of ideas, and the desire to give in to our addiction resurrects with an enormous force that we can't handle. And so the renewal of defeat is the ultimate source of despair. At the same time, it's a source of hope for those who have a spiritual view of the process, because it reminds us that we have to renew once again our total dependence on the higher power. And that this is not just a vocal acknowledgement of our need, but that we are feeling it from the very depths of our being. And so something spiritual in us that causes our whole being to vibrate is saying, help, at every level. And that's when the steps will begin to work. And that, I might add, is when the spiritual journey will begin to work. So a lot of people are really playing ring around the rosy with a lot of their activities that they regard as spiritual, because it's not communicating to them their profound dependence on the grace of God to go anywhere with these practices or observances. And that's why religious practice can be so ineffective apart from a kind of moralistic front that may get us a certain respectability in the community, but is not the real spiritual journey that depends on our acknowledging the unmanageability of our lives without the gift of grace. In other words, without God's constant support, encouragement, and invitation to move to deeper levels of acquaintanceship, friendship, and of love, because basically it is the love of God, or the higher power, that is going to heal us. Nobody becomes a full human being without love. It's what brings to life people who are most damaged. And the steps then after number one are really an engagement in the ever-deepening relationship with God that we could call, or should call, the love of God, or divine love, picking us up when we sincerely believe nobody else would, and beginning to put some freedom or peace or calm or equanimity or liberation from these drives or cravings for what we have come to see or know is damaging and does not bring happiness, but momentary or brief relief that then makes the real problem only worse and more difficult to unwind.
In step 1, Bill writes, only through utter defeat are we able to take our first steps toward liberation and strength. You may have touched on that, Father, in your sharing, but I wonder if you would comment on that concept of utter defeat.
This is a very difficult experience to deal with, but it's precisely the repetition of defeat, of trying to overcome the addiction and then falling back into it. In other words, losing one's sobriety or forsaking the recovery program that we've been in, or giving up the program, for instance. The same applies to practices of the spiritual journey, even without an addiction, because the addictive process is constantly preaching, you might say, the same pernicious doctrine that if only we do some of the things that take us away from our resolutions or our discipline, will we find some relief for the pain or the boredom or the struggle of dealing with particular tendencies that we are trying to correct. So powerlessness, then, you might say, is the result of frequent defeats, and this has a very dark side. That is, it tends to lead to despair, which is very painful, and prompts people to seek compensatory kinds of behavior because of the pain is too great to handle. On the other hand, from a spiritual point of view and ultimate wholeness and liberation, the hitting bottom, hitting utter despair, turns us over with complete dependence on the higher power, which is the radical foundation on which to build the friendship, because the healing that is taking place here is really gratuitous. It's a free gift, and so whatever efforts we put into it are prompted by grace from a religious perspective, and it's this grace that is liberating, not our efforts. So perhaps you can see the tension, the enormous tension that is building up here between constant defeat and the tendency to despair, and constant defeat and the inspiration to turn ourselves completely to God, not just in a few places, but totally. In other words, there is the sense of being gone, and this is reflected, incidentally, in the words of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, who says, "I've come to save that which is lost." And the word "lost" means blotto, totally gone, overwhelmed, defeated, hopeless, powerless, not worth giving another thought to, wiped out. This is what Jesus preaching, he has come to address this situation. So it can't be addressed alone or just by ourselves with any serious hope of healing. And so this applies equally to those on the spiritual journey, in the sense that they need to be realized through their own efforts at trying to improve their behavior and to establish a deep relationship with their God. If they don't succeed in their efforts, then they also begin to feel powerless. And that leads to discouragement, and that leads to deep discouragement, unless at the same time they're transforming through grace their defeats into motives for putting more and more confidence, trust, and dependence on the God that they are serving and on whom they are counting on to be saved, rescued from this disaster of an addiction, or to push it a little farther, from the addictive process itself, because that dependence or attachment to those programs for happiness that I mentioned before are so deeply embedded that people don't even realize how much energy they put into their realization until they begin to take notice and to introduce a program into their lives of self-knowledge and of behavior that is addresses some of their damaging activity. And so what Alcoholics Anonymous, it seems to me, has put its finger on is the most radical foundation or base for a genuine, complete, and holistic relationship with God that moves through levels of acquaintanceship, friendship, at easeness, union, and unity that all of the religions claim or are trying to lead their constituents into.
Thank you, Father. That was a wonderful explanation. Bill's another related topic. Bill's friend, Father Ed Dowling, once wrote an article about the underprivileged non-alcoholic, people who were unaware of the 12 steps, but help a ride for some of them, because Bill later wrote that many people, non-alcoholics, report as a result of the practice of AA's 12 steps that they have been able to meet other difficulties in life. Father Thomas, I think most therapists would agree that the vast majority of non-alcoholics are not aware of their hidden addictions or are in denial of the effect it's having on their lives. Can you give us a few examples of the more subtle kinds of addiction and how they keep us from realizing a deeper relationship with God?
Well, that's a good question, but it's a good comprehensive one. There is a certain blessing involved in having a very clear addiction that leads to consequences that are obvious, such as alcohol has done in its more outrageous forms, such as going to jail, or running a car into a tree and beating up one's children, becoming unbearable to live with, losing one's business. I mean, the whole string of disasters that people blissfully go through for the sake of the relief of a few drinks or a little binge that takes them away from the pain of their own sense of inadequacy or powerlessness. Now, alcohol isn't the only addiction. There's emotional addiction, there's sexual addictions, there are overeating addictions, there are gambling is for some people is an addiction. I suppose shopping is an addiction, favorite pastime for everybody on a Saturday afternoon or through the night in some cities.
Sports.
So what is pitiful is that the enormous capacities of human nature for growth and love and freedom and peace and service of others and reaching out to those in need or less privileged than ourselves, all of this immense potential is simply shoved off the table or out of sight in order to find some moments of satisfaction in the overindulgence in one or other of those addictions that I just mentioned. And the awareness that this is not the right way to proceed is usually present in some degree, but it has no effect on the conduct, and so it simply increases a feeling of guilt, perhaps, and the guilt is such a painful emotion that it increases the need to forget it through the exercise of addiction. The advantage of addiction from the point of view of the false self is that it provides an opportunity to be so preoccupied with the addiction, planning it, thinking about it, reviewing the consequences and all the rest of it, that you don't have time to think of how painful the attitude that one has interiorized, like oppression or rejection or unforgiveness or the many sources of addictions or the many complications that discouragement and humiliation and pain bring as a natural consequences and which reinforce the thirst or need or craving to forget it. And an addiction provides an ideal, perhaps the best way of forgetting those aches and pains which can be intolerable sometimes in some people. So what Bill W. seems to be saying, or Father Dowling, I forget which you mentioned, that ordinary people who are not involved in an immediate addiction don't realize that much of their behavior is somewhat compulsive or the result of over-identification with certain cultural norms or symbols of finding happiness in one or other of those instinctual needs. So they're blissfully unaware of how powerless they are, because they can fulfill the basic obligations of life, but the idea that their motivation is self-centered or selfish doesn't occur to them unless they take up a transformative practice like the spiritual journey or the 12 steps, or a life that is deliberately aimed at the transformation of our subhuman instincts into the human way of doing things. And do you want to pursue that with any aspect of the question I didn't address?
I think you've answered it pretty well. I think these hidden addictions, we probably need to hit a bottom of some sort, and then we change, no matter which addiction.
Yes, well, some of our addictions have to do with our way we relate to other people. Like some people are always aggressive, some are always withdrawing, some are not too sociable, some tend to be hostile, depending on their own background that they may, emotional background that they may not be very aware of. And that's why the idea that psychiatry has contributed to the spiritual journey that is so important for all of us who are trying to negotiate one to grasp is that most of our problems are unconscious. That is, that our emotional addictions are unconscious. And so we may, for instance, be very generous in offering our services for a party and to bring food and so on. But in actual fact, we're more interested in the approval of the guests or the people who are with us, and we're more interested in the approval of our friends and being invited to another party, and just to mention one. Then there's all the subterfuges that sometimes people engage in business, so they don't really present the product exactly as it is. It doesn't occur to them that there's something inauthentic about this. And so the real question is, why did you do that? I mean, what was your real motive for doing that? And so even religious practices can have mixed motivation, as is clear in many of the sayings of Jesus that address the human tendency to look for congratulations in a religious context from their good behavior or their generous observances, whether it's fasting or giving alms. Or obviously these are great deeds and we shouldn't stop doing them, but we shouldn't do them for the addictive tendency, motive of obtaining approval and esteem from these devout or praiseworthy activities.
Thanks, Father. We have just one question on the 11th step today. Father Thomas, the 11th step reads, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. I have a question. How can a person who is non-religious but believes in a higher power beneficially use centering prayer to accomplish the meditation requirement of the 11th step?
Well, centering prayer basically is has a very simple structure. And the basic experience that it communicates, if it's done according to directions, is to awaken in us the realization of what silence is interiorly. In other words, it translates the experience of quiet and no sound to the experience of what it's like to be quiet inside with no thoughts, or at least with no deliberate thoughts. The imagination is a perpetual motion faculty, and so it's usually grinding something out. But much of its discussions are not required in the sense that they're just habitual ways in which we talk to ourselves. Well, to deliberately not talk to yourself for 20 minutes at a time undermines the whole thought patterns that are reinforcing our emotional programs for happiness, and hence our addictions, which are rooted in the exaggerated nature of those programs and the consequent frustration or the consequent afflictive emotions like grief and anger when they're frustrated. So without your doing anything, just by indulging or resting or sinking into or focusing on interior silence, by not deliberately thinking any thought, you begin to undermine the habitual thought patterns of your whole life, which are reinforcing the addiction you may be in. So this can be an enormous advantage over time, because it's not that hard to do, and it doesn't require immediately actions in daily life. Spontaneously one begins to lose interest in the addictive process, or even in the addictions themselves. Some are so deep they're going to have to require other means, but that the exposure to silence has a kind of universal healing effect on everybody, no matter what their religion is. It's trans-religion. In other words, it's an innate capacity of human nature that, that is a part of life. And this silence is not so much a question of having exterior silence, because that's not always in our control, but of of sitting down with the deliberate intention just to be as an existing human being, just as you are in the presence of the higher power, without judgment, without plans, without memories, just to be in the present moment with that which is one definition of the higher power, or at least the highest power. So silence, in a sense, it communicates or transmits God, or something about God that we need to know. And that is that we're loved just as we are, and have a relationship with being by having some isness ourselves. So insofar as we be, so to speak, we're in relationship with the ultimate reality and with everything else that is. And this is the fundamental insight, a kind of cosmovision, you might say, or a kind of cosmic consciousness of the reality that underlies all the realities that we see, and that our own consciousness is somehow tucked into or emerging at every moment, or sustained at every moment by this greater consciousness that we call God in the Judeo-Christian religion, but has other names in other religions. But it's available to everybody because everybody, insofar as they're human, has this capacity to be still. And so we find the saying in one of the Psalms in the Hebrew scripture, "Be still, and you will know that I am God." And this doesn't just refer to sitting still, though that will help, but to this inner stillness of the imagination and the mind and the memory of our rational faculties and our concepts for a period of time. It's not a rejection of those extraordinary powers, but it's a recognition of their limitation, that beyond them is the world of reality that is characterized by silence and by realities that transcend our capacity to articulate them in words.